in so many early American households, if they had any books at all, you were likely to find the Bible there. And often you would find Foxe's Book of Martyrs. And Foxe's Book of Martyrs, I sometimes have come to say, like, the Bible sort of taught these Christians how to live. And Foxe's Book of Martyrs reminded them of the cost. And that's sort of what we hope to do too with this new book of Christian martyrs.
My name is Aaliyah Kirkendall. I'm here with the stream, talking today about martyrdom and a new book on martyrdom, which is called, I don't know if you can see it, The New Book of Christian Martyrs. It's authored by Johnny Moore and Jerry Pattengale, and I have them both here with me today. Johnny Moore is a speaker and an activist for human rights and religious freedom. And Jerry Pattengale is a professor at Indiana Wesleyan University, and he's a founding scholar of the Museum of the Bible. Thank you both for joining me today.
Great to be with you.
So this is quite an interesting work. It's called The New Book of Christian Martyrs, which is a reference to the very old book, Foxe's Book of Martyrs. That was written quite a while ago. Can you, Jerry, kind of give an overview of Foxe's Book of Martyrs and how this book relates for those who might not be familiar with Foxe's book?
Yes, it's one of the most read books in the English language. And what happened was, during the reign of Queen Mary, a lot of the Protestants at the time were put to death for their beliefs. And it was 1553 to 1558. So shortly after that time, John Foxe amassed all these stories in his lifetime. He produced 4 different volumes of this. Well, they grew larger and larger as he collected more stories. 2 huge volumes. Johnny and I have been with copies of them. They're just enormous. And people wanted to read about whom they called heroes of the faith. And it really encouraged them. And so many people have tried to kind of replicate this and kind of add stories. What we did is quite a bit different, though, from those early versions. This copy that you held up is large, but it was a lot larger when we started. I mean, we could have 5 volumes, 10 volumes, 50 volumes, but the publisher, Tyndall House, they did ask us to cut out, I think, 100,000 words or so, and it's still 600 some pages. So, Johnny, you might want to share how this is different than the early Foxe.
Yeah, happy to. I mean, as Jerry alluded to, I mean, Foxe's Book of Martyrs, a huge part of it was kind of transparently an anti-Catholic Protestant text. That's what it was. And one of the things that we did is, aside from, first of all, bringing it to our modern time, and something like a third of the book is all in the last century. There have been more martyrs in the last century than in the previous 19 centuries combined. But we also integrated in Catholic and Orthodox stories into the entire book, and part of this was just actually the inspiration of a Catholic. The Pope made a comment when ISIS was at its height in killing all these Christians in Iraq and Syria. He said there was an ecumenism of blood, and the point that he was making is that when the terrorists were coming and looking for who to kill, they didn't say, where are the Baptists or where are the Catholics or where are the Orthodox? They just looked for the cross. And so we decided that there were really powerful stories that deserved to be told, of both Catholics, Orthodox, and Protestant, and evangelicals and others, who've been killed through all the centuries, as an exercise to educate everyone on everyone, in order to maybe remind everyone that this is a sacrifice that all kinds of people through all Christian history have sometimes had to suffer.
So you added back into the history of that is covered by Foxe's Book of Martyrs, other streams of Christianity that he didn't cover, and then you updated with modern stories.
Yeah, and yet we did preserve when Foxe appears. I mean, and this is your reference to Jerry as a professor at Indiana Wesleyan. I always call Jerry an esteemed scholar, and I would not have been able and would not have done this project without collaborating with him, because Jerry's ability to actually deal with that historic text, it's not easy to do. It requires great respect and a significant understanding of history. And so what we were able to do is we were able to preserve the text while sort of expanding it. And this is an important part of our own American story. I mean, so many early American households, if they had any books at all, you were likely to find the Bible there. And often you would find Foxe's Book of Martyrs. And Foxe's Book of Martyrs, I sometimes have come to say, like, the Bible sort of taught these Christians how to live. And Foxe's Book of Martyrs reminded them of the cost. And that's sort of what we hope to do too with this new book of Christian martyrs.
Wow. You have a quote in the introduction from George Weigel: more Christians have died for the faith in the 20th century than in the previous 19 centuries of Christian history combined. I suppose that probably is part of what led you to write an update. Can you talk about what was your motivation for writing this book, and what from your background kind of led you to contribute to this?
Yeah, it's easy for us to actually forget what's actually happening right now. About the time I was born, Richard Wurmbrand was 12 feet under the earth for 3 straight years with no sound. And he ended up writing that famous book, Tortured for Christ. I sat and listened to his testimony just the other day, getting ready for these interviews, and that is moved to tears. And that's during my lifetime. And I read that book in college, and I just, how could that happen? And then find out that millions more have gone the same route. We just don't know their names. Johnny's closer to that. He's been to those countries. To those listening, Johnny's one of the principals in funding and organizing planes to go to the Middle East to rescue the persecuted under the Taliban, and then sent people, himself was included, to interview some of the survivors of those families of martyred Christians. And so, yes, it's a great question. It's so tough today because it's easy for us, even with all the information, not to realize what's going on. Johnny, you might have a comment on that and what's happening overseas.
Yeah, I mean, Jerry and I are really a great team because Jerry is, as I said, a historian and a scholar. In some of his earliest work, actually dealt with the Coptic Christian community and Coptic text, and Jerry's been all over Egypt, and he understands this piece of it. And then I've spent a lot of my adult life wandering around the world, talking to persecuted Christians. Some of those people, a lot of those people actually knew people who had died. Many of those people have been in prison themselves, have been tortured themselves. They've faced all kinds of painful experiences, and frankly, it changed my life. I had sort of a cultural Christianity. I was a born again Christian. I grew up in the Deep South. I knew Bible verses from the time I was a kid, not because I memorized them, but because I heard them so frequently. They ended up somehow implanted, way back in the back of my mind, and I thank God for that. But it was sort of only when I started hanging out with the persecuted church that my own faith came alive through the experience of spending time with these people. And that's sort of one of my hopes, for this book. And one of the reasons why Jerry and I spent 7 years working on this book, maybe a little more than that, is we, I think together have been deeply touched by our own understanding of the persecuted church. And we think, the modern church, particularly in the free West, needs to better understand the lessons that can only come through persecution. And the book of Acts isn't something that's just for the past, or Hebrews 11 at the end of the chapter when it talks about all the horrible things that happened to those early Christians. This is actually happening in real time in the world we're living in now, on a scale rare in history. While we're talking, people are dying, people are imprisoned. Most of those people's names will never be known to anyone. We have, in fact, one circumstance of the book, we don't know the names. We listed 10 to 15,000 North Korean Christians. We know it happened. We don't know the names of those people. And this stuff is happening a lot.
So you're talking about how the Western Church would benefit from hearing these stories of martyrs. What exactly are you seeking for the church to how to benefit, or what to understand? Do you see perhaps that the Western Church might need to prepare for persecution?
Yeah, there are a couple of books out that talk directly to that. What we try to do is chronicle what happens when people find themselves already caught. I mean, David Jeremiah, Todd Nettleton, Erwin Lutzer, they all write about what the possibilities are. What are the signs? Virginia Proda has Saving My Assassin. And, it's a book about what happened in Romania, where Richard Wurmbrand was tortured and she was almost killed. And all of them talk about really the creeping in of a radical, secular, non-moral approach to humanity. I mean, it's not so much, it starts out as a stark anti-Christian and something you can easily see. Now some things we would say that's what's happening, whether it's in America or other countries. But slowly it's a loss of freedom. David Victor Hansen, I'll never forget, he was being interviewed on Foxe one night. And it had to do with one of the things happening in, I think it was with the laptop, and it was some false information, or it had to do with people declaring something physically, their what gender they are or whatever. And David Victor Hansen just answered that, and he goes, they go, what do you think of at this point in American history? And he goes, death, rampant famine, despair. He goes, that's what happens to every country that begins to tell things other than the truth or believe them and propagate them. And he goes, it always ends that way. It ends in socialism. And we have a strong history of socialistic countries. And whether you agree or disagree with Victor Davis Hansen, it does make you think, what happens if we start ignoring some serious questions, and really with freedoms? And all the books I've read on this, it starts with the loss of freedoms and people sharing things that no one's really questioning. So,
yeah, I just add, in all of my work with persecuted Christians, I'm very careful to not draw stark parallels between people being beheaded in Western Africa and between restrictions of religious liberty in places like the United States. However, there are 2 points that are exceptions to that reticence to draw a comparison, and Jerry has raised them in his way. The first one is that all my persecuted Christian friends in countries around the world, they tell me it didn't start this way here. It started with marginalization. It started with discrimination. It started with truth being irrelevant. It started with a rapid secularization. It started with people viewing Christians as a threat, or traditional Christians as a threat, or whatever. So it's like a slippery slope, and then all of a sudden you're facing something you never thought you would face before. So there's that point. And then the second point is, most martyrs face an ultimatum. It's change your beliefs or die. And it occurred to me at a certain point of having conversations with people about this book that there actually isn't that big of a philosophical difference. There's a consequential difference, but not that big of a philosophical difference between change your beliefs and die, or change your beliefs or else. And the consequence may be different, but it's fundamentally the same ultimatum. And what we're seeing increasingly in the West is sort of ideologies that are vogue. Many Christians probably think that the number one persecutor of Christians around the world are Islamist terrorists. They're not. The number one persecutors of Christians around the world remain communists. And so when you sort of see like certain types of progressive ideology or people thinking, as we get further away from the Soviet Union, people thinking differently about communism and all of these things, and the blinking red lights of history say, if we don't know our history, we could repeat it. And so I think it is a wake-up call. I think reading these stories is a wake-up call to all of us. That these religious freedoms, particularly in the United States of America, we shouldn't take for granted.
Mm. And what is your desire that people would take away, if you have anything more to add to that?
I would hope that when they read this book, so we have sections throughout that are called cultural connections. And there are aspects of things that come down to the present, like even the name Catherine, and how you have a martyr, Catherine. St. Catherine's Monastery is named after Catherine's wheel. In 1917, it was the most popular woman's name, means pure, in America. Unfortunately, 2019. Delilah was 88th and Catherine was like 280th. So that kind of, if you just look at her name, it kind of shows a moving away from interest in that. But, Catherine's story is just amazing. I mean, she refused to recant the faith. And I think it was Maxentius thought she was brilliant, brought philosophers in to argue with her, early 4th century. And he wanted to marry her. He was so attracted to her beauty, her intellect. And she said, but I'm already married to Christ and I've committed my life to him. And so he got mad at her and ended up torturing her. And eventually they couldn't win her over. And so they put her on the wheel. And when they put you on the wheel in those times, they put your limbs kind of through the spokes and then take a huge, in the original Foxe, it talks about big tools, and we trace that back earlier in the earlier sources, whether they're clubs or big wrenches, and they would just smash your bones. And so she's on there, and they're doing that to her. And whether it's a hagiographic reference or an embellishment or not, what the account says is miraculously the wheel collapsed, and she lived through that. And finally, they beheaded her, and they really didn't want to behead martyrs because there were bones left, and then they would become relics, and then miracles would surface around them. But St. Catherine then became this legendary figure for standing up to the emperor. And then another account says her bones were taken by the angels to near where Moses got the 10 Commandments. And so that's why we have St. Catherine's Monastery there today. And whether you believe this part of the story or not, it's part of a historical narrative that people believe. The monks in St. Catherine's many years ago believed they found her bones there. And so then they renamed the cathedral St. Catherine's, one of the most famous monasteries in the world today. We're working with them through the Museum of the Bible. We have a couple of the main manuscripts out of there. So there's all these just powerful stories. And the takeaway is with cultural connections is, where do we see reminders of what they did? When you go into Oxford, you're getting ready to go up to Cornmarket Street, there's the martyr statue. And Johnny, I think we were on another interview or talking about how people just walk by and they weren't even paying attention, and others are standing there and they're moved. And I don't know if you want to comment on that, but those cultural connections from our book, trying to help people when they look around say, that traces to that martyr. That traces to what they're doing there. And so that's one of the big takeaways, I hope.
What were some stories that stood out to each of you? Maybe you could each highlight one that maybe has stuck with you or impacted you personally.
I can start on this one, Jerry. By the way, there's so many. There are 1,000 stories I could pick, but on the theme of St. Catherine, one of the things I love about this book is there are amazing stories of these incredibly strong, powerful Christian women throughout Christian history. And one of my favorite ones is the story of Perpetua. So she was this daughter of a nobleman. So a lot of the early Christians were like middle or lower class. They were, they didn't have very much. They didn't have much to lose in the world, right? But not Perpetua. She had everything to lose in the world. Her father was wealthy. The whole family was wealthy. When she became a Christian, it was bringing sort of public shame on the whole family in a society that wasn't accepting all of this. And the amazing thing about Perpetua is she actually wrote a diary while she was in jail awaiting her death. So she writes about the darkness in the prison cell. She writes about she had a newborn baby, like the experience of like taking care of the baby in the prison cell, how the guards treated her and others that were there with like less than the modicum of human dignity that basic prisoners should be afforded, even of the legitimately worse kind. And then eventually her personal account falls to silence, and then a historian who witnessed her death picks it up. And the story is unbelievable. I mean, this woman, like, she is arguing with her father. Her father wants her to recant her faith. The father, she's standing there. There's a vase in the room, like a flower vase. She points at the vase and she says, "Dad, what's that?" And he says, "It's a vase." And she says, "Can I call it by any other name than a vase?" And he said, "No." And she says, "Well, I'm a Christian. How can you call me any? I can't change my faith." And she goes out in the middle of the stadium, and she's carried out there. And first, an animal attacks her. She falls to the ground. One of the historians say she covers herself up, and then her hair falls down when the animal attacks her. And so she puts her disheveled hair up, because in that culture, in that period of time, it was like a sign of mourning if your hair was like down and disheveled. And so she wanted to like send a message that she to that crowd that was killing her, to heaven that awaited her, like she was leaving this earth, but she was leaving this earth proudly as a follower of Jesus Christ with her dignity intact. And her story, and that's just a part of the story. Her father comes running out in front of the judge with her baby and begs her to recant. Incredible story, like a movie. She dies for Jesus. Her story becomes famous in the whole world. She was 22 years old. She was just a young woman, and it changed so many. And there's so many stories like this.
Wow.
Yeah, and mine would be, so we have a whole section of women martyrs, which was not, I don't believe, in the earlier versions of this book. Just about 30 years earlier, AD 177, Glandina is, she's taken in, she was captured at 8 years old, and she was then, she converted to Christianity. And so she was put into what was called the griddle. Excuse me, I was getting confused with another martyr. She wasn't one, it was a later martyr. But anyway, she was taken out. She wouldn't renounce her faith. They put her in a griddle, which is an iron chair, sort of like an oven, because they had strapped her to a pole first, and the beast wouldn't come close to her. So then they put her in a chair in fire and tried to bake her alive. She didn't die. So they got mad. They put her in a basket and they threw her on the horns of a bull. The bull tossed her around. It was one of the most gory. It was in Lyon, France. And what happened was so many people were in awe of her fortitude that her story became very well attested and recounted throughout Christendom. And I'd be remiss not to close with this as far as an account. Whenever I sign one of these books for people, like we did a book signing the other day, and a pretty good line, and I'd always put page 467, because on that page is the story of Cheryl Beckett. And Cheryl was one of my students at Indiana Wesleyan. And she graduated, great biology student. She went on to help people in other countries learn to grow self-sustaining gardens or protect their eyes through certain things. And so she was on a mission trip, and you may remember the story in Afghanistan, where they were trying to get back from helping a village, and their jeeps couldn't cross the swollen creek. And the Taliban came down and saw them. They saw a Bible in the dash. They lined all 10 of the medical missionaries up and assassinated them one by one. And Cheryl was one of them. And she was 32 years old. Her father helped me write this part of the story. He went through her journals. I mean, can you imagine having any child go through that? And so Reverend Charles Beckett, her father, went through her journal, and he penned this for us. She wrote in her journal, which has been a spiritual oasis for me. Over and over again, I read this theme, no longer my own. I've been bought by Christ with his own blood. I want to know him better. And then this is the part, and it's just striking. And then she wrote, I want to die to myself. And then she asked the question to herself. Again, this is her father writing. What does that look like? How do I make that tangible? And that's Cheryl writing. That is what she devoted her life to, knowing him, but knowing him by sacrificially suffering in order to show him. I just can't imagine a father sitting down with a daughter's journal and writing it. Her picture's in the halls at Indiana Wesleyan, and whenever I'm on campus, I walk by, I'll stop, and actually a big picture hangs just outside my office.
And you think of these, I mean, these amazing stories. There are a thousand of these stories, and whether it's Jerry admiring the sacrifice of his student who became a martyr in our modern era, or Perpetua that I told you the story about. Everyone knows Saint Augustine. Everyone admires St. Augustine. Who did St. Augustine admire? He admired Perpetua. He wrote 4 sermons on Perpetua. His faith was inspired by Perpetua. Somewhere along the line, we stopped telling our future generations these stories. And it's astonishing to me that every living Christian leader doesn't know the story that Jerry just told of someone who died in our lifetime, much less, the stories from history. And that's the mission we're on. We're on a mission to get people to know the suffering church, and hopefully it'll inspire their own faith too.
Beautiful, thank you. Well, I have one last question, which might seem a little off the wall, but I know, Johnny, that you have spoken out about AI and even autonomous weapons, basically robots that would make decisions on who to kill. Do you see an intersection of the future of AI and the future of martyrdom?
Yeah, I actually do. I mean, we are entering into a period of time in history that no one has ever experienced before. I mean, the AI revolution in technology is totally transformative. And if you think I'm exaggerating, pull this video up about 18 months from now, and we're already seeing things that people don't fully comprehend. And one of the things about AI is an authoritarian country, which decides they want to hunt down and kill all the Christians in the most efficient way possible. It's very easy to do, if you have the right technology. And so, we are entering, without getting too deep into the technology of it. We are entering a period of time where if our leaders don't make wise decisions, technology can make decisions for itself based upon what we've told it to do, and then eventually what it thinks is best. And Unfortunately, history reminds us that technology and power don't always go well together. And my own personal mentor in human rights is a rabbi from the Simon Wiesenthal Center. Simon Wiesenthal lost like 89 members of his family in the Holocaust. He was an architect. He could have made a fortune in the aftermath of that horrible time period in history, investing his time and energy into rebuilding Europe and making money for himself. He didn't. He invested the rest of his life in hunting down every Nazi he could possibly find that imagined and tried to wipe every Jew off of earth. And Rabbi Cooper often recounts a story where he sat with Simon Wiesenthal at a university in Ohio on a visit to the United States. And the students asked, could this happen again? And Mr. Wiesenthal said it absolutely could happen again. And it could happen if evil is allowed to flourish and if the right technology exists. And I'm afraid we are moving way too quickly. And so this is absolutely why I joined my voice with Elon Musk and a number of the top scientists and technologists and professors around the world, and signing a letter calling for a 6-month pause on these gigantic machine learning projects, so we can get our hands around something, because this one we might not be able to stop.
Yeah, and I would just hitchhike on that. When you read back into history, when you read Night by Elie Wiesel, there wouldn't be a Night had they had better technology and were more efficient in the way they were killing everyone. It's on behind me here. I just read Unstoppable, a great book about just a phenomenal individual who survived Auschwitz. And there's no way he would have lived had they had better technology. And so I think that we can think through that. And speaking of technology, we shared with one of these book launches. We've been able to work with the original Foxe books. And I was sitting in Cambridge with these big volumes, and my heart was heavy, and long days, just these horrible stories, and just trying to get a feel for the whole project. This was years ago. And it was the same time I get a text, John, I don't know if it's from you or somebody, telling me that Scorsese's film Silence was hitting Cambridge that night. And so I left and went over straight from reading Foxe, for these ancient accounts, to a modern account of the Japanese martyrs. And I'll never forget, I walk in, there's maybe two families and me total in the whole place. And people don't want to hear about persecutions. I mean, it's just tough. And all of a sudden I smell popcorn. And then as the movie went on, as people are being crucified in the tar pits, these kids are kind of just asking their parents for more candy, and they go back out for some more refreshments. And on the screen was the best technology possible in presenting this picture. It was a powerful story. He did a good job telling it. And it was kind of depressing. But at the same time, it's that angst between living and enjoying life and the realities of evil, and the difference between good and evil, and the call to the cross for those who believe in Christ. And I left there sad. I don't think I slept that night.
And this is why it's also important to say that as Christians, we don't oppose innovation. I'm like an AI fanatic. I think AI is going to cure every disease that is persistent, that we can't figure things out. I think it's going to transform our lives in incredibly powerful ways, in incredibly positive ways. But its current trajectory is one that's going to rob us of all of those opportunities unless we get our hands around it. And this book, the new book of Christian Martyrs, is a reminder that evil is with us in every single period of history. It just had limiting factors. The Christians could hide underground. people could flee. It could, all of these things. The United States is way, way, way in advance on AI. We can take a break for a couple of months, without losing ground, to make sure that we have the safeguards in place. And ultimately, as Christians, I mean, we have every reason to be optimistic when it's all said and done. But as people of faith, we have, it is in our domain to talk about the ethics of lots of things, including this thing. So thanks for asking that question.
Yeah. Well, this is rather depressing, talking about death and the future of AI. I know I'm laughing, but it seems a bit bizarre, to imagine that. But as I was reading some of these stories, what struck me was this person who lived so long ago in such a different culture. Like, we have the same thing that's at the forefront of our lives, same faith, and just that sense of unity was so encouraging, I guess, to read these stories. What has been the most encouraging thing to each of you as you worked on this?
For me, you were talking about AI, which is a great question. We've not been asked that question yet. That was I don't think so. That was a great question. While we're doing this, and literally there are days I'd have to pause and just put my hands up above my laptop and say, Lord, help me. I just want to capture these and help Johnny to take this to the world. But while we're doing that, there were people getting together and putting together The Chosen. And there were people then that took The Chosen and used AI, if you will, and figured out how to take it to the world in the Come and See app. And so while we're doing this, and while some people will use AI for sinister ends, they always have. Every invention has had a technological dark side. It always will. That's the nature of humankind. And the Bible's true on that. It's always going to be that way. Well, that's happening. You have these people launching the Come and See app to take The Chosen free to the whole world. And then you have Bob Hoskins in Florida with One Hope, and they're using it. They're getting the gospel out. And so there's people that need to use it for the good and make sure that people not only know these stories but the Bible and get ready. And so there is a good side to this. And there are great Christian movies. I just came from Franklin. There's studios and musicians like Dylan Thomas and others there. And just so many great people using the technology to take their music and take their songs to the world. So it's encouraging.
Yeah, I'm totally optimistic. I mean, one of the lessons of this book is a famous phrase from Tertullian, who's a church father, who said that the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. And it is also the case. I have been all over the world. I don't know how many countries I've been to, and everywhere the church is growing, like everywhere. Like this is it may be like I moved around a lot in high school, and I had to read A Tale of Two Cities like 4 times, in 4 different schools, and all of these things. I don't remember much about A Tale of Two Cities, but I remember the first line, which was, it was the best of times and it was the worst of times. And that is definitely the case. Persecution, yes, it is a bad time for that. But the good news is, first of all, we don't grieve like those who have no hope. We serve a resurrected Lord. All around the world, the church is growing. People are finding blessings from the church, because the church not only grows theologically, everywhere the church grows, it's a blessing to these communities where it is. And so, yeah, this is, I think we're on the precipice of an amazing moment in history in a positive sense. I think we're seeing, maybe, we don't quite know yet, we'll look back in maybe 7 or 8 years, but maybe the first global awakening, in history. I mean, this is all happening in front of our eyes. And so we remember all of these people who've sacrificed their lives so that we can enjoy the blessings that we're seeing now today around the world. And so my favorite verse in the book of Romans. I don't know if this is heretical because Romans is filled with the gospel, and I got saved on the Romans road, so okay, putting the heresy aside, but my favorite verse in the book of Romans is I think it's verse 20, chapter 16, if I remember correctly, where it says, "Soon the God of peace will crush Satan underneath his feet." And I think we are seeing that right now all around the world. What the enemy meant for evil, God's using for good. And that empty tomb is still reverberating and defying death all over the world.
Amen. Yes. And the Bible also talks about faithfulness unto death being victory over Satan. And so those are many victories, and the Lord will crush the enemy. Thank you so much for sharing with me about this book and about martyrdom and your hearts. It's been a pleasure speaking with you both.
Thanks for having us. It was
Thank
our
you.
pleasure.